G'day guys, welcome to the second video in this series I'm putting together about eating ruddy fallow bucks. If you missed the first video, which went into detail about what the rut period actually is, there'll be a link above me somewhere or in the description, so click on that and watch that one first. This video is going to look at the overall health and condition of the fallow bucks during the rut and look at how it changes from the start of the rut to the end of the rut, and what that might mean for us as hunters when we are selecting deer specifically to eat.
We need to keep in mind that once the rut properly kicks off, the buck's primary concern is breeding does. The more does they have, the more they can breed, and keeping many does often involves needing to fight other bucks. In some places, the does vastly outnumber the bucks, and you may see one buck holding 20 or more does on a scrape. That's a lot of mating. In other places, where the ratio of buck to doe numbers is closer, you might see a buck holding up to 10 does maybe. If a buck is holding a large number of does, they have their work cut out for them to keep all those does occupied. If a buck is holding fewer does, it often means there is more competition at that spot and they have their work cut out for them keeping other bucks away. For the most part, bucks don't really eat anything during the rut. Some of the ones we've killed late in the rut have taken a long time to start bloating in the sun while field dressing because their stomachs haven't had any food in them. For the sake of venison quality, it is in our interest to shoot bucks earlier in the rut, but that doesn't mean the ones later in the rut are inedible. For bow hunters, early rut usually provides more opportunities because the bucks are moving around more and are more likely to be checking their scrapes and coming to rattles and doe calls. Having said that, I've shot many bucks with rifles in the last week of April, and while they've all been worn out and lacking condition, they've still eaten perfectly fine. Interestingly, if you're very much a trophy hunter and looking to shoot a deer that scores highly, the earlier in the rut, the better, as they've had less time to fight other bucks and break off pieces of their antlers that might have added more points to their score. Now we're going to take a look at some bucks that me or my mates or my wife have shot over the last couple of years and compare their condition.
The first buck we'll look at is this fella here. I'm counting him as my first ever archery fallow buck, even though I shot a buck the weekend before I shot this one, but unfortunately I did not recover that deer until a week after I got this one, so 2 weeks after I shot him. This buck was shot on the 22nd of March, so still very early in the overall rut period here in Australia, certainly in my area. You'll see when we were dressing him out that he was absolutely covered in fat, one of the fattest deer I have ever dressed out. We comment when we were cutting him up that he definitely smelled like a buck. He had a little bit of a rut smell about him, but he wasn't overly funky, he wasn't overly dirty, and he obviously hadn't started to spend all of his time fighting and mating because he was in such good condition. If I shot this buck a month later, not only would have he had none of that fat on him, but it's highly likely that a lot of these funky points on the back of his palms would have been busted off because he would have had an extra few weeks worth of fighting under his belt, and some of those more delicate points usually get busted off. So it's worth noting that if you are a dedicated trophy hunter and you want a deer that's going to score the best, the earlier in the rut you can shoot them, the better off the chance is that they're going to keep all their points. There are exceptions, but it's just a general rule to keep in mind. I'm not quite sure how it happened because a fairly mature deer like this is typically going to be a little on the tough side, but he was one of the most tender deer I have ever eaten. I actually cooked a simple backstrap meal for my wife and son and I fairly recently, and we just could not believe how tender he was. Whether that's because he just was not stressed out at all and he was in very good condition, I don't know. The overall point I'm making, guys, is This deer ate very well, even though he was a fairly mature animal.
This next buck is one that Bailey shot on roughly the 29th of March. This buck came to the rattle at the scrape where I shot a couple of deer in the weeks leading up to this. 29th of March is still early in the rut, but things were definitely starting to happen. You'll note that he still had plenty of fat on him, but there was nowhere near as much as the buck I shot the week before.
Just rattled in this buck from my mate Bailey. Yeah, it's the 29th of March, so it's still technically pre-rut.
Most of the other bucks we've shot in the last few years have been much later in the rut. Now we'll look at a couple of examples of bucks that were killed between peak rut and late rut, sometime between about the 8th of April, let's say, to the beginning of May. All of them have been eaten by my family and friends. This buck here was one my wife shot roughly around the 8th of April. Things were going to get very serious in the next few days, as the peak in this spot over the last handful of years has always kind of been between about the 12th and the 17th of April. He came to the rattle in some thick country, but he didn't make a sound as he strolled in very casually. He's obviously a mature buck and probably knew he was the boss of that patch. My reason for showing this buck is that when we were processing him and checking his liver, it was a lighter colour than we are used to. I sliced into the liver and some liver fluke came out, which is a squiggly looking parasite. It's always worth checking the liver of an animal you're going to eat. In this case, the liver is something you shouldn't eat, but the rest of the animal was fine to consume. This buck here is probably the best deer my wife has shot so far. A stunning creature to see in the paddock with how light his coat was. This was fairly late in the rut and I'd chased him for a week with my recurve but couldn't seal the deal. I asked my wife to come and shoot him with a rifle. Even though he's a nice, big, mature deer, you can see he's lost a fair bit of condition. Because he's such a light colour, it makes the dirty parts of him obvious, so if you aren't sure what I was talking about previously in the different video, you can see it clearly here. The last buck we'll take a closer look at is this old fella. A very mature deer and strong in the body, but he was obviously lacking good genetics in the antler department. You'll see some footage here of this buck just after a fight that occurred at this scrape, which is the same scrape my wife shot her white buck a few days later. This old buck came out of the bush and took on another big deer that was holding does at the scrape. The fight lasted about 10 minutes, and when it was all over, this one came out victorious. I actually shot this deer the year after that big fight, and it was at the exact same spot I'd seen him the year prior. My point here is, seeing a big fight like that for a hunter may not be very common, but it's fair to say these deer are beating each other up a lot more than we realise. It's no wonder they lose so much condition. You can see when I'm field dressing this deer that his fat stores are all burned up.
Hopefully you've got a bit more of an idea about how the condition of these bucks changes over the rut. In my experience, the ones that are in better condition eat a little better. That's obvious, but it doesn't mean the ones that are really strung out towards the end of the rut are inedible. But just because a nice fat buck in mid-March is going to be better eating venison than a buck that's shot in late April, it doesn't mean that that one in late April is not fit to eat. We might just need to be a bit more careful about how we dress it out and be a little bit more thoughtful about how we prepare it in the kitchen. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you'd like to be kept up to speed with when the next videos are coming out, hit the subscribe button. If you don't subscribe to channels or that's not something you're into, that's fine too. Just keep an eye out on the socials where you've seen these videos pop up, and that's where the next ones will be dropping as well. Cheers.